For hundreds of years, much of the new gold entering Europe's coins came from a place that Europeans could not name or find. It crossed the Sahara Desert on the backs of camels, and for long stretches of that history, one of the roads it travelled ran toward a single city. Stand in Gemma el Fnar Square at sunset. You are standing in that city, and you are standing in the middle of a 1,000-year-old argument with the desert. Storytellers still draw their circles of listeners here, the way they did when this was the edge of the known world. Above them rises the Koutoubia minaret, whose family of towers would rise again in Rabat and in Seville. And beneath the city and across the plain-run channels dug nearly 9 centuries ago, carrying the secret that made all of it possible. Water, moving invisibly under dry ground. This city was founded on land that seemed to promise nothing, by men who came out of the Sahara wearing veils, and it became the seat of an empire reaching from West Africa into Spain. It has been conquered, abandoned, rediscovered, and in 2023, shaken by the earth itself. It is still here. This is the story of Marrakech. Nearly 1,000 years in one journey. It begins with an empty plain, a line of camels on the horizon, and a decision that made no sense at all. Let's go down to the square. Chapter 1. The Impossible Ground. Before there was a city, there was a contradiction, and to understand Marrakech you have to see it with your own eyes. So imagine you are standing on a plain in southern Morocco, sometime in the middle of the 11th century. There is no city here, no walls, no towers, no roads worth the name, just a wide, dusty flatland, the colour of rust, stretching away in every direction, dotted with hardy scrub and the occasional stand of wild jujube trees. This is the Haus plain. The ground under your feet is dry. The air is dry. In summer, the temperature climbs past 100 degrees Fahrenheit, and the wind from the south carries the breath of the Sahara. There is a river to the north, the Tensift, but it is a river you cannot trust. For much of the year it runs low, and in the worst years it barely runs at all. By every rule that governed where cities were born in the medieval world, this place fails. Cities grew on great rivers, like Paris on the Seine or Cairo on the Nile. Cities grew on harbours and coastlines. Cities grew where water was reliable, because water was life, and a city is nothing but life concentrated in one place. Now turn around and face south. Filling the entire horizon, close enough that it seems to lean over you, stands a wall of mountains, the High Atlas, peaks rising more than 13,000 feet, taller than anything in the continental United States east of the Rockies, and on those peaks, even as you stand sweating on the plain, there is snow. Hold that image, because it is the most important image in this entire story. A dry plain, and hanging above it, a frozen reservoir of fresh water every winter. Storms rolling in from the Atlantic stack snow on those summits. Every spring the snow melts and comes down the mountain valleys, and then most of it vanishes, soaking into the gravel at the foot of the range, sinking underground, flowing unseen beneath the very plain you are standing on. The water is here. It has always been here. It is simply hidden. The Haus plain is not truly a desert. It is a locked room with a treasure inside, and for thousands of years, nobody had the key. So who lived in this land of contradiction before the city existed? The peoples of these mountains and plains called themselves in their own languages, by names usually rendered today as Amazigh. a word often popularly translated as free people or noble people. Though scholars debate its origins, the outside world has long called them Berbers, a name most researchers trace back to the old Greek and Roman word for anyone who spoke an unfamiliar language. It was not a compliment, and it was not the name they chose. In this story, we will use both names where it helps clarity, but it is worth knowing which one belonged to them. And here is something most people watching this have probably never been told. The Amazigh have lived across North Africa since long before the Arab conquests, and peoples widely regarded as their ancestors appear in some of the region's earliest written records, including Egyptian accounts from the age of the pharaohs. Rome fought them, traded with them, recruited them, and never fully ruled the mountains they held. When Arab armies swept across North Africa in the 7th century, they took the plains and the cities, but the High Atlas remained what it had always been, a Amazigh country. Over the generations that followed, its people largely adopted Islam and held on to their languages, their customs, and their independence while doing it. Keep them in mind. At the very end of this story, in our own century, their languages return in a way that would have astonished every empire in between. One more voice belongs in this chapter. The great 14th century historian Ibn Khaldun, born in Tunis, devoted part of his most famous work to the Berber peoples, and he described a pattern he saw repeating across North African history. Movements of hardened people from the desert and the mountains, united by faith, would rise and overwhelm the softer, richer societies of the settled lands. Then, within a few generations, the conquerors would grow soft and rich themselves, and the cycle would begin again. He was writing long after the events of our next chapter. He could have been describing them play by play. Watch for that cycle. It turns more than once before we are done, and the last time it turns, it takes a very modern form. In the 11th century, the Amazigh world was organized into great tribal confederations, and two of them matter enormously here. In the High Atlas lived the Masmuda, farmers and herders of the high valleys, masters of terraced fields and mountain passes, and far to the south, in the open Sahara, lived the Sanhaya, nomads who moved with their camels across distances settled people could barely imagine, and whose men were known for a striking custom. They veiled their faces, wrapping dark cloth across the mouth and jaw, while their women went unveiled. To the farmers of the north, these desert riders were mysterious and more than a little frightening. They are about 2 decades away from changing everything. It is not quite true that the region had no towns. Tucked into the foothills, a day's walk from where you are standing, was a town called Agmat, and Agmat was doing very well. The geographer al-Bakri, writing in Muslim Spain in the 1060s, described it as a prosperous trading town, home to wealthy merchants, sitting at the junction where mountain trails came down to meet the routes of the plain. Why was a foothill town rich? Because of what passed through it. For centuries, one of the great trade networks of the medieval world had operated across the emptiness to the south. Caravans crossed the Sahara, carrying salt toward the lands of the Niger River, and came back north, carrying West African gold. We will walk that road properly in Chapter 3. For now, what matters is this. The wealth of the gold roads flowed through this region, but no great power controlled it here. The land between the mountains and the desert was a borderland, contested by rival tribes and rival lords, wealth passing through weak hands, a treasure room with no guard at the door. So look at the plain one last time, dry ground that everyone overlooked, hidden water that no one had unlocked. Ancient peoples divided among themselves. Rivers of gold flowing past with no one strong enough to command them. The room was locked, but out in the deep desert, among the veiled riders of the Sanhaja, something was stirring. A movement was forming around an idea, and it was about to come north with a force that would redraw the map of 2 continents. The key was coming, and it was coming on the back of a camel. Chapter 2. The Men in Veils. Every city has a birth certificate, and most of them are forgeries. Rome had its wolf and its twins. Athens had its quarrelling gods. Marrakech has something stranger than either, because the story of its founding is not a myth. It is a documented event, and it still astonishes. A city with no river, established by a movement born far from the great cities it would soon govern, becoming the capital of one of the largest powers on earth within a single generation. Here is how it happened. Sometime in the 1030s or 1040s, a chieftain of the Sanhaja desert tribes came home from the pilgrimage to Mecca troubled by what he had seen. His people were Muslims in name, but out in the deep Sahara, far from any school or scholar, the faith had grown thin. So he went looking for a teacher. The man he found, according to the accounts preserved by later chroniclers, was a scholar named Abdallah ibn Yasin, and he became one of the most consequential religious reformers of the medieval world. Ibn Yasin preached a strict, disciplined, purified Islam, and the desert tribes did not immediately thank him for it. Early on he was resisted, by some accounts driven out entirely, but his movement hardened rather than died. His followers became known as Almoravids, a name European tongues would later soften into Almoravids. The name is usually connected to the Arabic word ribat, which can mean a fortified place of religious devotion. Though scholars still debate whether a single physical ribat ever existed, or whether the word described a spiritual commitment, a binding of oneself to the cause. Either way, the meaning in practice was the same: faith, organized like an army. And then the movement began to move. Within roughly 2 decades, the veiled riders had done something remarkable. They took Sigilmasa, the great caravan city on the northern edge of the Sahara. They took Oudegost, a caravan hub on the southern edge. Consider what that means. The Gold Road had 2 doors, one at each end of the desert, and the Almoravids now held both. The wealth that had flowed through weak hands for centuries was suddenly in the grip of a movement that was disciplined, expanding, and hungry. Ibn Yasin died in battle in 1059. Military command passed to a Sanhaja chieftain named Abu Bakr ibn Umar, and it is Abu Bakr who now makes the decision this story has been waiting for. The Almoravids had pushed north to the land of contradiction, where the mountains meet the desert routes, and they needed a base. The obvious choice was Agmat, the rich foothill town. They took it, and found it too small, too crowded, and perhaps too much someone else's. So in or around the year 1062, Abu Bakr led his people onto the open plain and made camp on the dry ground, in sight of the snows of the Atlas. Tradition holds that he purchased the land, and that the first structures were tents, then a stone fortress called the Qasar el-Hajar, then wells, driven down toward the hidden water. Traditional accounts often give 1062 as the founding year, and it is the year on the thumbnail of this video, but honesty requires a footnote spoken out loud. Many modern histories place the foundation closer to 1070. The records of the 11th century Sahara are thin, and the exact year remains genuinely debated. What is not debated is what the camp became. Even the name is a beautiful mystery. Marrakech most likely comes from Amazigh words, and the most widely repeated interpretation connects it to a phrase meaning something like land of God. Other explanations exist, and none can be proven beyond doubt. There is something fitting in that, and the name travelled further than the city. In several European languages, over the centuries, the city's name eventually became the name of the entire country. That is where the English word Morocco comes from. Now comes the twist that turns a founding into a story. A few years after the camp was established, word reached Abu Bakr that war had broken out among the tribes in the southern desert, the movement's homeland. He decided he had to go back and settle it himself. Before he rode south, he did two things. He placed the new settlement and the northern campaign in the hands of his cousin, a quiet, capable commander named Yusuf ibn Tashfin, and he released his own wife from their marriage, so that she would not endure the desert, telling her, in the traditional account, to remarry. Her name was Zainab, and she deserves a moment of her own. She came from the merchant world of Aghmat, a woman the chroniclers describe as wealthy, brilliant, and politically gifted. Some accounts written generations later called her a sorceress, which is often what medieval writers called a woman whose intelligence they could not otherwise explain. After Abu Bakr rode south, Zainab married Yusuf ibn Tashfin, and the partnership of those two, her wealth and political skill, his patience and iron discipline, built everything that came next. Because when Abu Bakr finally returned from the desert, years later, he found that his cousin had not merely kept the camp warm. Yusuf had expanded the armies, secured the region, and turned the tent city into a working capital. The chronicles preserve a scene that historians still argue over, and even if some details grew in the telling, its outcome is fact. Abu Bakr rode north expecting to resume command. Yusuf met him with lavish gifts, with honour, and with an army that was now unmistakably his. No battle was fought. The older man read the situation, accepted the gifts, and rode back into the Sahara, where he spent the rest of his life leading the movement's southern wars. Yusuf ibn Tashfin kept the north, and the city. It was one of the great peaceful transfers of power in medieval history, and it happened on the dusty plain of a settlement barely a decade old. Think back to Ibn Khaldun's cycle: hardened people from the desert, united by faith, taking the settled lands. Here it is, moving like clockwork. But before we watch Yusuf turn his camp into an imperial capital, we need to answer the question underneath everything. What exactly was everyone fighting to control? What was actually out there, on the roads of sand? It is time to join a caravan. Chapter 3: Gold, Salt, and the Roads of Sand. In the early 1350s, a traveller named Ibn Battuta rode out of the caravan city of Sijil Masa and into the open Sahara. He was already the most travelled man of his age, a Moroccan scholar who had spent decades crossing the Islamic world and much of Asia, and he wrote down what he saw. His account of the desert crossing survives, and it is one of our best windows into a trade network that quietly shaped the medieval world. Because for centuries, a share of the new gold entering the markets of Europe and the Mediterranean, the metal behind coins and royal treasuries, had been carried north across this desert on the backs of camels. Historians of the medieval economy trace that flow, again and again, to West Africa. Large parts of the medieval Mediterranean economy depended on gold brought north from beyond the sand, and almost no one in the north knew where it came from. The people of Marrakech knew. and the city was about to grow rich on that knowledge. To understand the trade, start with a simple, brutal equation. In the great river valleys of West Africa, along the Niger and the Senegal, there was gold in quantities that astonished every outside observer. Washed from riverbeds and dug from fields in regions the sources call Bambouk and Bure. But those same lands had almost no salt, and salt, in a hot climate, before refrigeration, is not a seasoning, it is survival. Your body loses it constantly. Food cannot be preserved without it. Meanwhile, in the middle of the Sahara, in one of the most lifeless places on the planet, there was a site called Taghaza, where the ground itself was salt, slabs of it, cut from ancient dried lake beds like blocks of white stone. Travellers who passed through, Ibn Battuta among them, describe a settlement where even the buildings were made of salt, worked by labourers in conditions of terrible hardship. We should not romanticize that. Much of the labour in the desert salt mines was forced, and the caravan trade we are about to follow also carried enslaved human beings north across the sand. That is part of this story too, and we will not pretend otherwise. So, salt in the middle of the desert, gold south of it, cities and empires north of it. All that remained was moving goods across a sea of sand wider than the distance from New York to Denver, with no roads, no rivers, and, for stretches of 10 days at a time, no water. The answer had 4 legs. A camel can carry hundreds of pounds of cargo, travel for days without drinking, close its nostrils against blowing sand, and walk on ground that would cripple a horse. After the camel spread through the Western Sahara in the early centuries of the Common Era, the desert stopped being a wall and became a highway, a slow, lethal highway, but a highway. Now put yourself in the caravan. You leave Sijil Masa in the cool months, because no sane person crosses in summer. Around you are hundreds of camels, sometimes thousands, roped in long lines, loaded with cloth, copper, books, and salt. Your life now depends entirely on one man, the guide, and the sources are explicit about how such men worked. Ibn Battuta describes guides who knew the desert by the look and feel of its sands, and he describes the graves of travellers whose guides had been wrong. You move in the cold hours, sometimes at night under the stars, navigating the way sailors navigate. You measure your life in wells. Some are 10 days apart. If one has silted up or gone dry, the caravan does not mourn. It walks faster. 2 months of this. Then, out of the shimmer on the southern horizon, the trees of the Niger River country, and the market towns where the 2 halves of the equation finally meet. In the greatest years of the trade, the exchange rate defied belief. Medieval reports describe salt trading in the goldfields at extraordinary prices, in some accounts approaching its own weight in gold, even allowing for exaggeration, and historians do allow for it. The margins were enormous. One more detail, because it is too strange to leave out. Several medieval writers describe a custom from the far edge of the goldfields called the silent trade. Merchants would lay out their salt and goods, drum to signal, and withdraw. The gold miners would come, place a quantity of gold beside the goods, and withdraw in turn. No words, no faces, sometimes over several rounds, until both sides were satisfied. Modern historians genuinely debate how literally to take these accounts, and some suspect the story grew with retelling. But whether literal or embellished, it reflects something the record makes clear. The sources of the gold stayed hidden from outsiders for a very long time. Many tried to find the mines. For centuries, the secret held. If you want to know how much wealth was really moving, look at what happened when a single West African ruler decided to show off. In 1324, Mansa Musa, the Emperor of Mali, made the pilgrimage to Mecca and passed through Cairo, carrying so much gold and spending it so freely that Egyptian writers of the period record the value of gold in Cairo sagging and staying depressed for years afterward. One man, one journey, and he dented the economy of the richest city in the Mediterranean world. That is what waited at the far end of the roads of sand. Now pull back and look at the map the way Yusuf ibn Tashfin looked at it from his new city on the Hawz plain. Every caravan needed a place to end. Somewhere the gold became coins and cloth and weapons. Somewhere the desert met the settled world, where merchants could bank, resupply, and pay taxes to whoever was strong enough to collect them. There were several such places across North Africa, and they rose and fell as routes shifted. But Marrakech, positioned between the passes of the High Atlas and the caravan country, and backed by a movement that already held the desert doors, became one of the major northern organizing centers of that trade. It was never on the sand itself. It sat just beyond the sand's reach, with mountain water underfoot, at a point where the wealth of one world changed hands to enter another. Think of it as a port. Great trading cities sit where two worlds meet, and neither can proceed without stopping. Venice, between Europe and the eastern Mediterranean. Hong Kong, between China and the ocean. Marrakech, between the Sahara and everything north of it. The desert was its sea, the caravans were its ships, and the gold of West Africa was its tide. By the 1080s, that tide was coming in hard. Yusuf ibn Tashfin had the city, the water, the discipline, and the gold. What he did with them next would carry the name of Marrakech across the strait into Europe. Chapter 4. An Empire from the Sahara to Spain. Hold an Almoravid gold dinar in your imagination for a moment. A small, heavy disc, struck in Marrakech or Sigil Masa. Its surfaces covered in elegant Arabic script. Numismatists, the historians who study old money, have traced these coins into markets and treasuries far beyond the Islamic world, where they were prized for the purity of their gold. A currency, in the medieval world, was a reputation you could hold in your hand. And by the 1080s, the reputation of Marrakech was excellent. West African gold, flowing through Almoravid hands, was being minted into one of the most trusted currencies of the age. But a capital needs more than gold. It needs water. And here we return to the promise of Chapter 1, because this is the era when the locked room begins to open. In the Almoravid period, engineers began driving a remarkable technology into the plain of Marrakech. The system is known in Morocco as the Ketara, and it works like this. You go upslope toward the mountains and dig a mother well down to the groundwater flowing off the Atlas. Then you dig a tunnel, sloping ever so slightly downhill, running for miles underground toward the city, with vertical shafts for air and access. Water seeps into the tunnel and flows, by gravity alone, to the gardens and cisterns of Marrakech. No pumps, just geometry, patience, and an exact understanding of the invisible. Similar systems existed across the Islamic world and ancient Iran, where the technology is usually called a qanat, and historians still discuss which routes carried the technique to Marrakech. From the air, A Ketara looks like a line of craters marching across the plain, each one the mouth of a shaft. From the ground it looks like nothing at all. That was the miracle of it, the sun, which stole every drop of open water, never touched this water, but we should be precise about what kept it flowing, because it was not magic. A Ketara demands constant clearing, repair, and organization. Generations of maintenance governed by inherited water rights. The tunnels survived the rise and fall of dynasties precisely because they belonged to communities, not courts. Chroniclers and later visitors describe the plain transforming, over generations, into a belt of gardens, palm grovers, and orchards. The city founded on dry ground became famous, of all things, for green. Remember the water. At the very end of this story, 9 centuries from now, it is still the question everything else depends on. Now, with gold in the treasury and water in the ground, watch how fast history moves. Yusuf ibn Tashfin pushed north through Morocco, taking Fez in the 1070s and extending Almoravid power toward the Mediterranean. Then, in 1085, an appeal arrived from across the Strait of Gibraltar that changed the scale of the story entirely. Muslim Spain, the land known as Al-Andalus, was in trouble. The once mighty Caliphate of Córdoba had shattered decades earlier into a patchwork of small rival kingdoms. The Taifa states, ruled by princes who wrote beautiful poetry, built beautiful palaces, and paid tribute to the Christian kings of the north because they could not defend themselves. In 1085, King Alfonso VI of Castile captured the great city of Toledo. Panic spread through Al-Andalus, and the Taifa princes, swallowing their pride, sent across the strait for the one power that could save them, the veiled emir of Marrakech. One of those princes is remembered for a line that may be legend but deserves to be true. Asked whether he feared what the Almoravids would do once invited in, Al-Mutamid, the poet king of Seville, is said to have replied that he would rather herd camels for the emir of Marrakech than herd pigs for the king of Castile. He would live to test the first half of that sentence. Yusuf crossed with his army in 1086. That October, near a place called Sagrajas, in what is now southwestern Spain, the Almoravid army met Alfonso's Castilian host, and the sources describe a battle unlike anything the Spanish kingdoms had faced. Massed African infantry behind walls of hide shields, great drums whose sound is said to have frightened horses that had never heard them. By the accounts of both sides, Alfonso escaped with only a remnant of his army. Sagrajas did not undo the fall of Toledo, but it froze the Christian advance for a generation, and it announced something extraordinary. The camp on the Haouz plain, 1 generation old, was now a power in European history. What followed is Ibn Khaldun's cycle running exactly on schedule. Yusuf came, saw the Taifa princes up close, and concluded that men who taxed their people heavily, lived in luxury, and could not fight were not allies worth preserving. Between 1090 and his death, he deposed them one by one and annexed Al-Andalus outright. Al-Mutamid of Seville ended his days a prisoner in Ahmat, the old foothill rival of Marrakech, where his tomb still stands. Visitors today can stand at the grave of the man who chose the camels. Step back and look at the map in the year 1100. One power ruled from Marrakech, its empire and sphere of influence reaching from the western Sahara and the Senegal River country, across Morocco, into most of Spain and Portugal, Historians are careful to note that control in the far south was looser than in the north, influence shading into rule. But the centre of the whole web was never in doubt. It was the new city on the dry plain, where African gold, Saharan discipline, and Andalusian civilization now met. The court drew scholars, puts, physicians, and engineers from Cordoba and Seville. Marrakech was becoming a northern capital of the south and a southern capital of the north at the same time. Now come down from the map, because an imperial capital is not a map. It is a place where people wake up and go to work. Walk the Marrakech of Ali ibn Yusuf, the founder's son, in the 1120s. The streets near the Khazar el Hajar smell of the tanneries and the cook fires. Water runs in channels along the lanes, feeding public fountains where women fill jars at dawn. And the fountains are becoming works of art, their basins carved, because a city that conquers the desert likes to show off its water. Andalusian craftsmen, brought south from Spain. You are teaching local builders the geometry of the horseshoe arch and the secrets of carved plaster. In the book market, scribes copy law and poetry for a court that now reaches to the Atlantic. And everywhere, the veils. The ruling class still wraps its faces in the desert manner, a nomad custom worn now by the masters of an empire, in a city of gardens their grandfathers could not have imagined. Under Ali, whose mother, worth noting, was a Christian woman from Spain, the money poured into stone and clay, mosques, palaces, fountains, bridges, and in 1126, facing new threats we will meet in a moment, Ali did the thing that gives Marrakech its face to this day. He wrapped the city in walls. The walls were built of rammed earth, the red clay of the Hausa plain itself, mixed with lime and packed hard between wooden forms, course by course, mile after mile. The colour of the walls is the colour of the ground they stand on. Marrakech is red because the plain is red, almost 20 feet high, studded with towers and gates. The circuit ran for miles around the city, and its core still stands in 2026. Travellers who run a hand along those ramparts today are touching the 1120s. Remember the walls. Everything this story throws at the city for the next 900 years will be written on them. Yusuf ibn Tashfin had died in 1106, an old man who had begun life as a desert cavalry commander and ended it ruling territories on 2 continents. By every account, he never stopped living simply, wearing wool and eating plainly while governing an empire of silk. His son Ali inherited the gold, the walls, the gardens, and the empire, and yet within a single generation, the whole structure was cracking, not from Spain, not from the desert, from the mountains that had been standing over the city all along, up in the high Atlas, in the villages of the Masmuda tribes. A preacher had come home from the east with a burning idea and a list of accusations. The Almoravids, he declared, the veiled reformers of the desert, had become exactly what they once overthrew. Rich, comfortable, corrupt. The cycle was turning again, and this time the hard men were not coming from the sand. They were coming down from the snow. Chapter 5. Fire and the Perfect Tower. Every empire believes its founder's story can only happen once. The Almoravids, of all people, should have known better. They had risen as desert Puritans, overthrowing soft city princes. And now, in the 1120s, the word reached the red walls of a mountain preacher named Ibn Tumart, who was telling the Masmuda tribes of the high Atlas that the rulers of Marrakech were the soft ones now. Ibn Tumart was, by the accounts that survive, a formidable and unsettling figure, born in the Atlas. He had travelled east to study, and he came home preaching a stern doctrine of the absolute oneness of God. His followers called themselves Almoravids, the proclaimers of God's unity, a name Europeans would flatten into Almohads. He declared the Almoravids not merely corrupt but religiously in error, which turned rebellion into holy obligation, and in a step his followers accepted. He claimed the title of Mahdi, a divinely guided leader, from a mountain stronghold at Tinmel, high in the Atlas south of Marrakech. His movement organized the tribes with a discipline the desert had once monopolized. A pause for honesty. Most of what we know about Ibn Tumart comes from sources written under the empire his movement created, which had every reason to polish the story. The details of his life must be treated with caution, but the movement itself, and what it did next, is as solid as history gets. The Almohads came down from the mountains in waves. An early assault on Marrakech in the 1130s broke against Ali's new walls. The first repayment on those ramparts. Ibn Tumart died around 1130, and leadership passed to his brilliant lieutenant Abd al-Mumin, who spent the following years dismantling the Almoravid state province by province, until only the capital remained. In 1147, after a long siege, Marrakech was taken by force. The chronicles describe killing in the streets, the deaths of the last Almoravid rulers, and a conqueror's verdict on the city itself. The Almohads, the chronicles report, declared the mosques of their enemies improperly aligned toward Mecca and pulled the greatest of them down. It was a way of saying that everything the Almoravids had built, even their prayers, had been wrong. Barely 80 years after its founding, Marrakech had been conquered for the first time by the mountains it could see from its own walls. And then something interesting happened. The conquerors did not abandon the city, they doubled it. Abd al-Mumin and his successors kept Marrakech as their capital, and what they built there over the next 60 years turned a rich trading city into one of the intellectual and architectural centers of the world. The empire they assembled exceeded even the Almoravid one, stretching across North Africa toward the borders of Egypt and up into Al-Andalus. The gold road still ran, the Kettera still flowed, and the money went, above all, into a building near the old palace. The Almohads raised a great congregational mosque, rebuilt it almost immediately, and beside it raised a minaret that became one of the most admired towers of the medieval world. The mosque came to be called the Kutubiyya, a name connected to the Arabic word for books, because, in a detail that tells you everything about this city's second act, the streets around it filled with booksellers and manuscript dealers, a tower named, in effect, for the book market at its feet. The minaret of the Kutubiyya, completed in the later 12th century, stands about 250 feet tall, built of local sandstone, decorated with carved arches and bands of ceramic, crowned with copper spheres. Its proportions are so exact that architectural historians have studied it for centuries, and it did not remain alone. The same dynasty raised two others in the same family of design, one in Rabat, the Hassan Tower, left magnificently unfinished when its patron died, and one in Seville, in Spain. The minaret of the great Almohad Mosque there. When Christian conquerors later took Seville, they kept that minaret, crowned it with a bell chamber, and renamed it. That tower is the Giralda, the symbol of Seville to this day. If you have stood in that Spanish plaza and admired it, you were looking at the Marrakech member of the same Almohad family. dressed in later clothes, and the family kept travelling. When architects in the early 20th century United States wanted romance for their skylines, some reached for the Giralda's silhouette, and buildings including the tower in Miami, now called the Freedom Tower, are described by architectural historians as its descendants. At several removes, the skyline of Florida carries an echo of the Kutubiyya. The Almohad court did not stop at architecture. For a few remarkable decades, Marrakech and the Almohad cities of Spain formed a single intellectual world, and some of the greatest minds of the Middle Ages moved through it. The philosopher Ibn Tufayl served the court and wrote a philosophical tale about a child raised alone on an island who reasons his way to truth. A book that, centuries later in translation, is considered by many scholars an influence on early modern European thought. His protege was a judge and physician from Cordoba named Ibn Rushd, known to Europe as Averroes, whose commentaries on Aristotle became so foundational that medieval European scholars called him simply the commentator. Averroes worked under Almohad patronage, fell from favour late in life, and died in Marrakech in 1198. His body was carried home to Cordoba. But the city where his story ended was this one. Students in Paris and Oxford would spend the next 3 centuries arguing with a mind that had done some of its work in the shadow of the Kutubiyya. There is a strange irony here, worth saying plainly. A dynasty founded by a preacher of rigid certainty ended up sheltering some of the boldest philosophy of its age. Empires are rarely consistent. They contain their own contradictions, right up until the contradictions win. For the Almohads, the contradictions won in Spain. In 1212, a coalition of Christian kings crushed the Almohad army at Las Navas de Tolosa, a battle Spanish schoolchildren still learn as a turning point of the Reconquista. The empire did not fall that day, but its spine was broken. Within decades, Cordoba and Seville fell to Castile. The African provinces spun away under rival dynasties, and the caliphs in Marrakech ruled less and less, while their court intrigues grew more and more elaborate. In 1269, a new power out of the north, the Marinid dynasty, took Marrakech, and the Marinids did something no conqueror had yet done to this city. They ignored it. The new masters of Morocco packed up the apparatus of empire and moved it north to Fez, the counting house of the Sahara, the city of the Kutubiyya, capital of 2 empires in 2 centuries, woke up one morning as a provincial town. The walls still stood, the tower still called the Faithful, the water still ran in the dark underground, but the story had moved away, and it would stay away for 250 years. What happens to a great city when history stops looking at it? That is the next chapter. It is quieter than anything so far, but not empty, because out on the Atlantic, in the shipyards of a small, poor country called Portugal, men were building vessels that would do to the roads of sand what the roads of sand had once done to everyone else. Chapter 6. Adolescence. The Long Sleep. What happens to a great city when history stops looking at it? We tend to imagine that cities are like people, that they die when their glory ends. The truth is stranger. Cities can sleep. They can lie for centuries in a kind of suspended animation. Purer, quieter, half-emptied, and then wake when the world needs them again. Marrakech was about to demonstrate this over 250 years. And what a city keeps while it sleeps is what it has when it wakes. Begin with the moment the lights went out. In 1269, the Marinids completed their conquest and moved the capital to Fez. This was not spite, it was geography. Their power base was northern. Their wars were in the north. against Spain and against rivals to the east, and the gold roads themselves were shifting over time toward routes that fed other cities. Fez sat closer to everything the new masters cared about. Marrakech sat closer to a past they did not need. So the court left. The money followed the court, and the scholars followed the money. The chroniclers give us glimpses of what remained, and the glimpses are sobering. Travellers describe quarters inside the great walls standing empty, gardens dying back, the palace precinct of the Almoravids decaying into a quarry for anyone who needed cut stone. The city did not vanish. It contracted, like a fire burning down to coals inside walls built for a blaze. Picture what that contraction may have felt like from the street. On a market morning, sometime in the 1400s, you come in through the southern gate behind a line of mule drivers hauling almonds and hides down from the mountain valleys. Inside the walls, the scale disorients you. The streets near the gate are alive. Stalls, forges, the smell of bread and leather. But walk 10 minutes and the crowd thins, and you pass whole lanes of shuttered houses, a collapsed roof with a fig tree growing through it, an old fountain gone dry, its tile face cracked by decades of sun. Then you hear water. In the gardens on the southern edge, the channels still run. Fed by tunnels nobody bothers to explain to a stranger. And under the palms, men are harvesting dates within sight of ruined palaces. A city living quietly inside the body of an empire. 3 things stayed alive through the whole long sleep, and they are the 3 things this film has been tracking. The water stayed, because the Qattara channels depended on gravity, local maintenance, and inherited water rights rather than royal budgets. Many of them survived the withdrawal of the court. The families and neighbourhoods that owned them kept them cleared, and the groves they fed kept bearing fruit. The tower stayed. The Kutubia still called the faithful 5 times a day over half-empty quarters, too holy to abandon and too well built to fall. And the square stayed. The open ground of Gemar Elfna remained the city's meeting place, its market and its stage. The full history of performance there is genuinely hard to trace century by century, and we should not pretend to a precision the sources do not offer. What can be said is that by later centuries, travellers described the square as the living room of the city, filled at evening with storytellers, musicians, and crowds, and that this tradition, the halqa, the circle of listeners, became one of the most enduring forms of public performance anywhere. A city without a court entertains itself. When no one else would look at Marrakech, Marrakech looked at itself and told stories. One more thing accumulated in the quiet, almost without anyone deciding it. Sanctity. Across these centuries, the tombs of revered religious figures multiplied in and around the city, and pilgrimage to them grew into a tradition later formalized around 7 patron saints of Marrakech. A city that had lost its political capital was quietly banking a different currency, and in Morocco that currency has never devalued. Meanwhile, out in the world, the ground was shifting under everyone's feet, and to see it we have to leave the city and stand on the deck of a ship. Through the 1400s, a small, poor kingdom on the Atlantic edge of Europe was solving a technical problem with world-changing consequences. Portugal wanted West African gold, the same gold that had fed Marrakech for 4 centuries, and Portugal did not control an inch of the Sahara, so the Portuguese went around it, ship by ship, cape by cape. Their captains felt their way down the African coast. In 1415, Portugal seized the Moroccan port of Ceuta itself. By the 1480s, Portuguese ships were reaching West African gold through Atlantic coastal trade, at fortified posts on the far coasts, without a single camel. Understand what that meant for our story. For centuries the desert had been a wall with one kind of door, and Marrakech had grown rich, standing beside the door. Now the ocean was a highway, and the highway went around the wall. The caravans did not stop, and historians rightly caution against writing the trans-Saharan trade's obituary too early, because it persisted, in changing forms, for centuries more. But the old monopoly was broken. The tide that had built the city was going out. Worse followed. Through the late 1400s and early 1500s, Portuguese power bit into Morocco's own coastline, seizing or fortifying a chain of Atlantic ports. And from those bases, raids reached inland, the Moroccan interior, divided under a weakening dynasty, could not answer. It was in these years that a young diplomat from Fez passed through Marrakech, a man known to history as Leo Africanus. Born in Granada and raised in Morocco, he was later captured at sea and brought to Italy, where he wrote a description of Africa that became, for European readers, the continent's standard portrait for a century. His account was set down later, from memory, and shaped for a European audience, so it must be read with care. But used carefully, it is a precious window, and his pages on Marrakech are a portrait of faded greatness. He describes magnificent monuments, and he describes emptiness, quarters in ruin, colleges with few students, palaces whose builders' names were being forgotten. It is the sleeping city, recorded by one of the sharpest observers of the age, and his sadness reads clearly across 500 years. But even as Leo wrote, the wake-up call was sounding in the south, in the valleys beyond the Atlas. Anger at the Sultans' failure against Portugal was gathering into something new. And notice, because you have seen this twice now, where the waking came from. Not from the palace, from the periphery, from the hard country, organized around faith. In the early 1500s, in the Sousse and Dra valleys, a family claiming descent from the Prophet Muhammad began rallying the tribes to fight the Portuguese where the sultans in Fez would not. They are known to history as the Sardians. Their lineage gave them religious authority. Their war gave them legitimacy, and their geography put them on the southern roads, the old caravan country, with Marrakech sitting before them like a crown waiting on a table. In 1524, the Sardians took Marrakech. Within a generation they had driven the Portuguese from most of their Moroccan strongholds, including the great southern port of Agadir in 1541, and by the 1550s they ruled the whole country. Then they made a decision that reversed 250 years in a single stroke. They did not rule from Fez. They came back to Marrakech. The coals were about to become ablaze again. The sleeping city was about to receive wealth on a scale the Almoravids never dreamed of, a palace that ambassadors would struggle to describe, and a single day of battle, involving 3 kings and the fate of 2 empires, that would shock every court in Europe. Chapter 7. Sugar, Sultans, and the Battle of 3 Kings. In the 1500s, one of the most profitable substances on planet Earth was something Americans now buy in 5-pound bags without a second thought: sugar. Europe, in the 16th century, was falling in love with sweetness, and cane sugar was still a luxury, produced in only a few places, traded at prices that put it in the company of spices and silver. The Sardian sultans of Marrakech realized they were holding a winning hand. Southern Morocco had sun, and the mountains, as you know better than anyone by now, had water. On the Howes Plain and in the southern valleys, the dynasty built plantations and industrial sugar works, and archaeologists who have excavated sites such as Chichawa, west of Marrakech, describe complexes of impressive scale, water-driven crushing mills, boiling houses, refineries. Historians of the period record Moroccan sugar moving into European markets in serious volume, and one detail has become famous. English merchants were among the eager buyers, trading English cloth and metal for Moroccan sugar in the era of Queen Elizabeth I. A detail later writers have enjoyed repeating alongside the Queen's own famously blackened teeth, though what actually darkened them is not something we can settle here. We owe the record a darker sentence too. Sugar production in this period, in Morocco as elsewhere, was brutal labour, and the workforce included enslaved people. The sweetness of the age was paid for in suffering the ledgers barely bothered to record. That is true of the entire early modern sugar economy, and Morocco was no exception. So money was flowing again, and in 1578, an event turned the flow into a flood, and it began with a young king's fantasy. Sebastian, King of Portugal. He was 24 years old, intensely religious, and raised on crusading romance. When a deposed Sardian sultan appeared at his court asking for help recovering the throne from his uncle, Sebastian saw his moment of destiny. He assembled a great army, drained his kingdom's treasury to fund it, crossed to Morocco in the summer of 1578, and marched inland. The reigning sultan, Abd al-Malik, though gravely ill, came north to meet him with a larger force. They met on August 4th, 1578, near Qasr el-Kebir in northern Morocco, in a battle Moroccan tradition calls the Battle of Wadi al-Makazin and European tradition calls the Battle of Alcazar, or simply the Battle of the Three Kings. The name is earned. By the day's end, all three royal claimants were dead. Sebastian of Portugal was killed in the fighting, though uncertainty and legend would later surround the identification of his body. And for generations afterward, pretenders and prophecies of his return haunted Portugal. The deposed sultan drowned in the river during the rout, and the victorious Abd al-Malik died of his illness during the battle itself, a death his commanders are said to have concealed until the victory was complete, issuing orders in the name of a man who could no longer give them. The consequences detonated across 2 continents. Portugal had lost its king, much of its nobility, killed or captured for ruinous ransoms, and its treasury. Sebastian left no heir. Within 2 years, Philip II of Spain claimed the vacant throne, and Portugal, one of the great powers of the age, lost its independence for 60 years. Meanwhile, in Morocco, the dead sultan's brother was proclaimed ruler on the battlefield itself. His name was Ahmad, and to it was now attached the title Al-Mansur, the victorious. Europe's ransom payments and diplomatic gifts poured into his treasury. A battle he had not commanded had made him one of the richest and most courted rulers alive, and he was only beginning. Ahmad al-Mansur ruled from Marrakech for a quarter century, and he ran his kingdom like a chess master, playing several boards at once. He corresponded and negotiated with Elizabeth I of England, and the surviving letters show their envoys discussing trade and even the possibility of joint action against their common enemy Spain. A Moroccan ambassador and his retinue spent months in London in 1600, and scholars of English literature have long noted that Shakespeare wrote Othello, his tragedy of a noble Moor, within a few years of that embassy's stay. though whether the visit shaped the play remains a scholarly speculation, not a fact. Then, in 1590, Al-Mansur looked south, at the oldest map in this story, and did something no Moroccan ruler had ever done. He sent an army across the Sahara itself, roughly 4,000 soldiers, many equipped with firearms, marched south from the Dra Valley onto the caravan roads you travelled in Chapter 3. The crossing cost terribly, and the sources suggest a large share of the force died on the sand. But the survivors, in 1591, met the army of the Songhai Empire, the great power of the Niger River country, near Tondibi. Songhai's forces were far larger. They had almost no firearms. The Moroccan guns settled the day, and Timbuktu and the river cities fell. The plunder of the conquest flowed north. Gold, goods, and enslaved captives, in enough quantity that Al-Mansur gained another title, Al-Dahabi, the Golden One, but the full ledger deserves reading. The invasion shattered Songhai and helped tip a stable region into long instability. Among the captives marched north was Timbuktu's greatest scholar, Ahmed Baba, who spent years in Marrakech in forced exile, teaching and, in words that survive, mourning his stolen library. And the lasting profits of the whole adventure fell short of the golden expectations that had inspired it. Holding cities across a desert proved ruinously expensive, and within decades the Saharan conquests drifted out of Moroccan control. The last great act of the caravan age was also, in hindsight, its closing ceremony. While it lasted, though, the gold became a building. In the heart of Marrakech, Al-Mansur raised a palace called El Badi, a name usually translated as the Incomparable, and for once the diplomat's letters home suggest the name was not a boast. Accounts from the period describe a vast courtyard with a monumental pool, pavilions faced in Italian marble, gold worked into the ceilings, craftsmanship from both shores of the Mediterranean. One report famously claims the marble was purchased from Italian merchants weight for weight with sugar. Whether or not that story is precisely true, it is repeated because it captures the economics of the age perfectly. Sugar into marble, sweetness into stone. Al-Mansur died in 1603, apparently of plague, and the cycle you can now hear ticking on your own struck again with almost cruel punctuality. The golden Sultan's sons tore the state apart within a decade. The sugar economy withered under competition from Atlantic plantations worked by enslaved labour on an even larger scale, and the incomparable palace itself would eventually be stripped to its bones by a later dynasty, its marbles carted away to adorn a new capital. Today, El Badi is a magnificent ruin of red earth walls and sunken orange gardens, patrolled by storks, and it is one of the most haunting places in the city precisely because you can stand in it and measure the distance between incomparable and empty. But Al-Mansur left one more legacy, a small building he raised for his family's dead, glittering and intimate, tucked beside a mosque near the palace quarter. In the chaos after his death, and in the centuries that followed, that building would be sealed away and slip from the wider world's knowledge, until the 20th century, when its rediscovery would become one of the most repeated stories in Morocco. The tombs are waiting in the dark. Chapter 8 is where we open them. Chapter 8. The Hidden Tombs. In the winter of 1917, in the 5th year of the French Protectorate, survey officers in Marrakech were studying aerial photographs of the city. Flight was new, and one of the first things it changed was archaeology, because from the air a city keeps no secrets. Streets, courtyards, rooftops. All of it lies open like a diagram. And in the photographs of the quarter near the Casbah Mosque, something odd stood out. Tucked against the mosque wall was a walled enclosure with rich rooftops and a garden, a compound of obvious importance, with no clear way in from the streets around it. What happened next has been retold so many times that we should be careful to separate the record from the reconstruction. The record is this. In 1917, the French Colonial Heritage Service investigated the enclosure, confirmed what it held, restored it, and opened a proper entrance for visitors. The commonly repeated account of the moment itself, the version told in Marrakech to this day, describes workers opening a narrow passage and stepping into a place that time had sealed like a letter, a garden of overgrown graves, and two pavilions whose interiors had waited in the dark, away from the sun that fades everything in this city. Ceilings of carved and gilded cedar, columns of Italian marble, plasterwork cut as fine as lace. However embellished the telling may have grown, what they found is not in dispute. These were the tombs of the Saadian dynasty. Al-Mansur was there, the golden sultan himself, under the marble of the grandest chamber, surrounded by his family. Dozens of tombs in the pavilions, and well over 100 more graves in the garden. The obvious question drives this whole chapter. How does a city lose track of the tomb of its greatest king for 2 centuries? The answer begins where chapter 7 ended, in the wreckage of the Saadian collapse, and it introduces the dynasty that continues to rule Morocco today. In 2026, in the mid-1600s, as Saadian power dissolved into civil war, a new family rose from the oases of the Tafilolt, on the desert roads east of the Atlas. They were the Alawites, and like the Saadians before them, they carried the authority of claimed descent from the Prophet Muhammad. By 1669, their sultan held Marrakech, and the Saadian era was formally over. Then came Moulay Ismail. He ruled for more than half a century, from 1672 to 1727, and he is one of the most extraordinary and most feared figures in Moroccan history. European visitors to his court wrote accounts that circulated widely, describing a ruler of terrifying energy who built a new imperial capital at Meknes, in the north, on a scale meant to rival Versailles, and who enforced his will through a famous standing army. The Abid al-Bukhari, built largely from black Moroccan and sub-Saharan populations through coercive recruitment and enslavement, a formation whose origins and status scholars still study and debate. Those same European accounts gave Ismail a reputation for casual, lethal violence that the writers likely exaggerated but did not invent, and their testimony has to be weighed with care, since fear and rumour inflate such stories. What is beyond dispute is what he did to Marrakech. He stripped it. The incomparable palace of El Badi was systematically dismantled over years. Its marbles, we are told, carted north by the wagon load to beautify Meknes. The city taken by force in 1147 was now being quarried by its own crown. But when it came to the Saadian dead, Moulay Ismail stopped. Royal graves, in Moroccan tradition, carry a sanctity that even a man like Ismail would not casually violate. So instead of destroying the tombs of the dynasty he had replaced, tradition holds that he walled them in. The compound was sealed off from the streets, leaving access, it appears, only through an obscure passage from the mosque itself, and then the centuries did the rest. The tombs were never truly erased from local knowledge, and worshippers at the mosque remained a wall away from them. But to the wider world they became largely inaccessible, neglected, and unrecorded, a rumour at the edge of the city's memory, a dynasty's glory, filed away like a document in a drawer that everyone slowly forgot how to open. Hold the image of that sealed drawer, because it fits the 2 centuries we now have to cross, the longest quiet stretch in our story. And this time, let us not cross it from the map, let us cross it from the street, because these were the centuries when ordinary Marrakech, the Marrakech of workshops and markets and neighbourhoods, took the shape it still largely has today. Walk into the Medina Inn. Say, the 1750s. The great empires are gone, but the city is intensely, stubbornly alive. It is organized like a body with specialized organs. Near the Kutubia and the main mosques cluster the booksellers and the notaries. Radiating outward run the souks, and each has its trade, sorted street by street. Here the dyers, their hands and forearms stained blue and crimson, hanging skeins of wool to dry on lines strung above the lane. Here the coppersmiths, a street you hear before you see, 100 small hammers keeping a rhythm that does not stop from dawn to dusk. Here the leather workers, whose tanneries on the edge of the quarter fill the air with a smell you never forget. The whole thing is governed by an old institution, the guild, which sets the rules of each craft and the prices, and by another figure who runs the Medina's daily life, the muhtasib, the market inspector, who checks weights, settles disputes, and keeps the bread honest. Water threads through all of it, from the ketera and the cisterns, to the fountains, to the hammams, the public bathhouses whose furnaces are fed, in a neat closing of a circle, by the wood shavings and waste of the very workshops around them. Nothing is wasted in a city that has learned to live lean. This is the Marrakech that the empires left behind, and it is tougher than any of them. But toughness was tested hard in these centuries, and honesty requires saying how hard. The chronicles and, later, European consular reports describe a grim rhythm: drought, then failed harvests, then hunger, then, often, disease. Plague visited more than once, and in the worst episodes, the sources describe streets emptied and quarters silenced. The great famine of the late 1770s, remembered across Morocco, fell heavily on the south. Population figures for these centuries are genuinely uncertain, and any number should be treated with caution. But the pattern is not in doubt. The city would swell in good decades and shrink in terrible ones, and the walls that Ali ibn Yusuf had built for an imperial capital now enclosed a great deal of garden, orchard, and open ground where the population had contracted away from the ramparts. You can feel the changed world in what Morocco sent abroad. In the imperial centuries, the south had exported gold, sugar, and armies. By the 1800s, European merchants came for leather, wool, almonds, gum, and ostrich feathers, fine goods, honest goods, but the goods of a country that was slipping to the edge of other people's economies rather than sitting at the centre of its own. And through that century, the European powers circled closer. France conquered neighbouring Algeria beginning in 1830. Spain fought Morocco in the north. European banks entangled the Sultans in debt, and European treaties pried open Moroccan markets on terms Morocco did not set. The country kept its formal independence through the entire 19th century, one of very few in Africa to do so. But each decade the room to manoeuvre narrowed. For Marrakech specifically, the 19th century brought a late flare of importance under a sultan named Moulay Hassan I, who ruled from the 1870s to the 1890s and understood that holding the fractious south meant showing himself there. He based himself in Marrakech for long stretches, restored monuments, and built, and it is under his reign that we get one of the last great images of the old order. A sultan personally leading his army through the mountain passes to collect taxes and enforce loyalty, because a tax that cannot be collected in person is not really owed. Remember those expeditions into the Atlas. On one of them, in a snowstorm, the old world of the mountains is about to hand its power to a single ambitious family. And that handover will shape everything that happens to Marrakech in the century to come. By the early 1900s, the ending was written in the diplomacy of Europe. France and Spain, with the blessing of the other powers, had divided Morocco into zones of influence. And in 1912, after riots, ultimatums, and a rebellion that briefly besieged Fez, the Sultans signed the Treaty of Fez, accepting a French protectorate over most of the country. In theory, the Sultans still reigned, and France merely protected. In practice, the French resident general governed, and everyone knew it. Which brings us back to the tombs, because it is no accident that they returned to the light in 1917, 5 years into that protectorate, through French officers with airplanes and survey maps. The colonial project came to Morocco with soldiers and tax collectors, but also with archaeologists, restorers, and cataloguers, people whose work we still rely on and whose presence was, all the same, part of a conquest. The reopening of the Sardian tombs holds the whole ambiguity of the coming era in a single scene, a treasure of Moroccan civilization, given back to the world by the empire that had just taken Morocco's freedom. Today the tombs are among the most visited monuments in the country. Their lace-cut plaster, photographed by crowds who step out of the sunlight of a living city into the cool dark of the 16th century. The sealed drawer had been opened, and the era that opened it was about to remake Marrakech more profoundly than any since the Almoravids, under the rule, in the south, of one of the most fascinating and chilling men in this entire 1,000-year story. He was not a Frenchman. He was a chieftain from the high Atlas, the very mountains where we just left Moulay Hassan struggling through the snow. It is time to meet the Lord of the Atlas. Chapter 9. The Lord of the Atlas. In the winter of 1893, a sultan's army was dying in the snow. Moulay Hassan I, whose tax expeditions we watched at the end of the last chapter, was returning north through the high Atlas when the weather caught his column in the passes. Men and animals froze, and in the mountain fortress of Telouet, the local chieftains fed and sheltered the failing army, and their hospitality changed their family's destiny. The grateful sultan, in the often repeated accounts of the era, left his hosts titles, authority over the region, and one gift that would matter more than any title, a working bronze cannon, at a time when the mountain clans fought with rifles at most. We should hold that cannon story a little loosely, since it comes down to us largely through Glower family tradition and the colonial writers who found it irresistible. But whether the family's rise turned on one cannon or on many advantages at once, the outcome is documented. The hosts were two brothers of the Glower tribe, and the younger, Thami el-Glawi, was a young man at the time. In the tribal politics of the Atlas, artillery was less a weapon than an argument few could answer. Over the following 2 decades, the Glower brothers used their sultan's favour, their fortress astride the mountain road, and their growing arsenal to break their rivals and make themselves masters of the mountain south. and when France imposed its protectorate in 1912, and a rebellion in the south briefly threatened Marrakech itself. The brothers made the calculation of their lives. They sided with France. The rebellion was crushed with their help, and Thami el-Glawi was confirmed a Pasha of Marrakech, an office he would hold, with one brief interruption, for the rest of his life. The French called men like him grands cadres, great chieftains, and governed the vast tribal south through them. It was indirect rule, the same technique the British used with princes in India, and it made el-Glawi, in everything but name, Viceroy of southern Morocco. What kind of ruler was he? The honest answer is 2 men in one body, and the fascination of him is that both were real. To the international elite of the 20s, 30s, and 40s, he was a legendary host, the man whose invitations the famous crossed continents to accept. His palaces entertained European aristocrats, American millionaires, film stars, and statesmen. He golfed, kept fleets of automobiles, and appeared at a coronation in London. Winston Churchill met him repeatedly and enjoyed his company, and the friendship between the two was genuine, which is worth sitting with, because the second man in that body was one of the most effective authoritarian bosses of the colonial age. Within his domains, el-Glawi controlled justice, taxation, and commerce, and the accounts of Moroccan nationalists and later historians describe imprisonment of opponents, seizure of fortunes, and a share taken of nearly everything of value that moved in the south. The international press of his day ranked him among the richest men in the world, and however loose those rankings were, the scale was not in question. His mountain seat at Tellaway grew into a sprawling kasbah of reception halls and painted ceilings, a palace in the clouds, built and staffed by a rule most of the people beneath it had never chosen. Now widen the lens, because while the Pasha ruled the old city, the French were building a new one beside it, and this surprises many first-time visitors even today. The Protectorate's first resident general, Hubert Liauti, held an unusual doctrine for a colonial governor. He believed the historic Moroccan cities should not be gutted and Europeanized, as had happened in parts of Algeria, but preserved intact, with modern European quarters built separately outside their walls. Under his direction, planners laid out a new town west of the Medina, with avenues, cafes, and villas, the district called Geliz, its main artery aimed, in a piece of deliberate theatre, straight at the Kotobia, and from the Protectorate era onward, planning rules have generally protected the minaret's command of the skyline. You can debate Lioti's motifs, and historians do, since preserving the Medina also meant framing it as a picturesque museum while power and money settled in the new town. But the effect was that Marrakech entered the modern age with much of its 1,000-year body still intact. Few cities in the world can say the same. Picture a plausible evening on that new avenue in the early 1930s, because the strangeness of this divided city is worth standing inside. Behind you, electric streetlights, a cinema marquee, French spoken at the cafe tables, automobiles parked under young trees still too short to give shade. Ahead of you, framed at the end of the avenue like a painting hung on purpose, the Kutubia, 7.5 centuries old, and behind it the snows of the Atlas turning pink. A rider on a mule carries account books down from the mountain estates. At the cafe tables sit a French officer, a Moroccan merchant in a white djellaba, a foreign traveller with a guidebook. 2 cities, 1 skyline, and everyone at those tables behaving as though the arrangement will last forever. The world arrived on schedule. The railway and then the airfield connected Marrakech to Casablanca and to Europe. In 1923, a grand hotel opened beside the walls, set in an old royal garden, and took the garden's name, La Mamounia. Within a decade, it was one of the famous hotels of the world, and its most devoted celebrity guest was Churchill himself, who first came in the mid-1930s and returned for decades, setting up his easel in the gardens. He called Marrakech, in a phrase preserved in his letters, the loveliest spot in the whole world. And then, for 1 week in January of 1943, the traffic of famous guests became history itself. The Second World War had come to North Africa. American and British forces had landed in Morocco and Algeria the previous November, and in January the Allied leadership met in Casablanca to plan the next phase of the war. When the conference ended, Churchill insisted, and insisted is the word the memoirs use, that President Franklin Roosevelt could not leave Africa without seeing Marrakech. The two men drove south together, and at sunset Churchill had the president carried up to the rooftop of the villa where they were staying, so that Roosevelt, who could not climb the stairs because of his paralysis, could watch the light die on the snows of the Atlas behind the Couture. Members of both parties wrote the scene down. The two leaders of the Western war effort, side by side on a Marrakech rooftop, looking at the mountains. The next morning, after Roosevelt departed, Churchill stayed one more day and painted the view, the tower and the Atlas in the evening light. By the accounting of his biographers, it was the only painting he completed during the entire Second World War, and he sent it to Roosevelt as a gift. Its real value is, as a fact, almost too neat for fiction. In the middle of the worst war in human history, the one image the war's most famous voice chose to keep was the skyline of Marrakech. The war passed, and the world it left behind began dissolving empires. The American presence had added a new contradiction to colonial rule, because Allied rhetoric about freedom and self-determination was now being heard inside a protectorate that granted neither. The Moroccan nationalist movement, whose roots ran far deeper than the war, issued a manifesto demanding independence in 1944, and the young Sultan, Mohammed V, who had reigned quietly since 1927, began, carefully at first and then openly, to place himself at the head of that movement. The French position hardened, and Tami el-Glawi, now an old man, made the last great calculation of his life. This time, fatally. He calculated wrong. He bet on France against the throne. He declared against the Sultan, organized the chieftains and religious figures who shared his interests. And through 1952 and 1953, he applied every ounce of his weight to the campaign that ended. In August of 1953, with Mohammed V deposed and flown into exile, the Pasha had removed a king. What he could not remove was what the king had come to mean. How that gamble ended would become one of the most extraordinary reversals in modern Moroccan history, and it is where our next chapter begins. Chapter 10. Independence and the Return of the King. Come down into the Medina on a warm evening in the late summer of 1953, and listen. The news is moving through the lanes faster than any radio, passed hand to hand in the doorways. The Sultan is gone. The French have taken him, first to Corsica, then, soon, to the distant island of Madagascar. In a courtyard house off a narrow derb, a family gathers around a radio, turning the dial past official announcements that explain nothing they want to know. The grandmother has stopped her cooking, A boy is sent to fetch an uncle, and comes back wide-eyed with what the men in the square are whispering. Outside, the ordinary sounds of the night are all wrong. Too few footsteps, too much quiet, and the Pasha's police stand at the corners of the square where the storytellers usually gather. You keep your voice down. Everyone keeps their voice down. And in that lowered voice, something is hardening that will prove stronger than everything the Pasha and the Protectorate can put against it. The calculation behind the exile had been simple. The Sultan had aligned himself with the independence movement. So the Sultan had to go. A pliable elderly relative was installed on the throne in his place, and the plan assumed the Moroccan people would eventually accept the substitution. The plan achieved the exact opposite. Exile turned a cautious monarch into a national symbol. Across Morocco, resistance spread and sharpened, and a story travelled with it, that people looking up at night could see the face of the exiled king in the moon. Historians cite that story precisely because of what it reveals. The question of one man's throne had fused with the question of the nation itself. Attacks on colonial targets multiplied. The Pasha's police answered with arrests and worse. And France, already fighting a draining colonial war in Vietnam and facing the beginnings of another in Algeria, was running out of strength to hold the line. By late 1955, Paris conceded the unthinkable. Negotiations opened for the Sultan's return, and Tami el-Glawi, reading the new reality with the same cold clarity he had applied his whole life, made his last public act one of surrender. That autumn he declared for the Sultan he had helped depose, and in November of 1955, while Mohammed V was still in France preparing to return home, the old Pasha travelled there and was received by him. The accounts of that meeting describe the Lord of the Atlas, now visibly ill, lowering himself before his king in submission and asking forgiveness, and the king raising him up and granting it. Days later, Mohammed V landed in Morocco to crowds that observers described as the largest in the country's memory. El-Glawi died of cancer weeks afterward, in January of 1956. In March of 1956, France formally recognized Moroccan independence. The Protectorate had lasted 44 years. The Glawi palaces were confiscated. The family name became a byword, and the era of the great Cades closed with a completeness history rarely provides. His world ended with him in a way you can still see. The Kasbah at Telouet was abandoned within a decade, and today it stands half-ruined on its mountain, painted ceilings open to the weather, one more incomparable palace returning to the ground, while the road below carries travellers toward the film studios of Ouarzazate. So, in the spring of 1956, Marrakech woke up free, and now it had to figure out what it was for. Think about what this city had been across our story. A capital of empires, twice, a counting house of the Sahara, a provincial town, a colonial showcase. Now it was none of those things. The caravans were long gone, killed by ships and boarders. The court was in Rabat. The money was gathering in Casablanca, and the new nation's face was turned toward the Atlantic and toward Europe, not toward the desert. Marrakech at independence was a city of just over 200,000 people, rich in walls and towers and poor in almost everything else. The decades that followed were hard, and honesty requires sitting with that hardness rather than skipping to the happy ending. Independence did not bring instant prosperity, and the countryside around Marrakech felt it worst. Drought returned in its old cycles. The mechanization of farming reduced the need for rural labor. So began one of the great quiet migrations of modern Moroccan history. families leaving the villages of the Atlas and the Hawes plain for the city. Looking for work the city did not always have. Marrakech more than doubled its population in the first decades of independence. New neighborhoods spread outside the walls. Some planned, many built by the newcomers themselves. And the distance between the garden villas of Gwelles and the crowded quarters of the periphery became one of the defining facts of city life. And here we should stay in those quarters for a moment, because the tourist Marrakech that the world now pictures was, for most of the people who actually lived here, not the point. The real city ran on work. In the souks, the old crafts continued, and a boy apprenticed to a coppersmith or a weaver or a woodworker at 8 or 10 would spend years learning by hand what no school taught. Women held together an entire economy that the ledgers rarely counted. In the home workshops, the food trade, the weaving, the city ate from the Hawes plain, its markets piled with olives and oranges and mint, and the mountain Amazi came down on market days to sell and to buy, their languages mixing with the Arabic of the Medina in a way that had been going on since the beginning of this story. There was hardship in this world, and there was also an intactness that other cities, remade by industry and demolition, had already lost. Marrakech entered the modern age poor, crowded, and, in a way it did not yet know how to value, whole. Politically, these were tense years for the whole country. Mohammed V died suddenly in 1961, and his son Hassan II ruled for the next 38 years with a mixture of political skill and severity. The decades from the 1960s into the 1980s are known in Morocco as the Years of Lead, a period when opposition was met with imprisonment and fear, a record that human rights organizations and, later, Morocco's own Reconciliation Commission have documented at length. Marrakech was not the center of those storms, but no Moroccan city stood entirely outside them. In 1984, protests over prices and hardship touched cities across the country. This too is part of the story, and pretending otherwise would be the kind of dishonesty this film has promised to avoid. And yet, through all of it, something in the old city held a value the planners of those hungry years could not see. Marrakech had never stopped being astonishing. The red walls still ran their miles around the Medina. The Koutoubia still ruled the skyline. The gardens still drew their water from the plain. And every evening in Gemma el Fna, the storytellers still gathered their circles. The food stalls still sent up their smoke. And the halka played on as it had through every regime this story has covered. Independent Morocco, moreover, made a choice in these decades whose payoff no one could have predicted. Rather than modernize the Medina by demolition, as many countries were doing to their historic cores in the 1960s, the authorities largely left it standing. Some of that was policy, and some, frankly, was poverty, because grand redevelopment costs money the country did not have. The effect was the same either way. While other ancient cities bulldozed their pasts, Marrakech kept its own, nearly whole, wrapped in its 1126 walls. A city that keeps its past is holding a lottery ticket, and the draw was coming, far away, in California and London and Paris. The 1960s were inventing a new kind of traveller, young, restless, allergic to their parents' vacations, looking for somewhere that felt like another world, somewhere with light and colour and music, somewhere cheap. They were about to find it, and one shy French fashion designer, stepping off a plane into the Marrakech light, was about to fall for the city in a way that would help change its fortunes for good. Chapter 11. Hippies, Couture, and the Square That Would Not Die. In 1966, a shy, already famous French fashion designer named Yves Saint Laurent arrived in Marrakech for the first time. The story, told many times by his partner Pierre Berguet, is that they came for a short winter holiday, saw the light and the colour of the Red City, and bought a house before they left. For the rest of his life, Saint Laurent returned twice a year, and he said repeatedly in interviews that Marrakech taught him colour. Look at fashion photography before and after the late 1960s and you can see what he meant. The palette of European couture suddenly catching fire with saffron, fuchsia, and desert blue. He was not alone on the plane. The late 1960s brought a wave of Western artists, musicians, and seekers to Morocco, and Marrakech became one of their capitals. Members of the Rolling Stones famously retreated here in 1967, in an episode retold in every biography of the band. Crosby, Stills and Nash put the city's name on American radio in 1969 with a song named for the train to Marrakech, Marrakech Express, and a generation of young travellers took the title as an instruction. The hippie trail had found its African terminus. Some of what those travellers brought was money. Some was nonsense. All of it was attention, and attention, for a city that lives on wonder, is rain on dry ground. Hollywood had arrived even earlier. Alfred Hitchcock filmed scenes of The Man Who Knew Too Much in Gemma Elfner in the 1950s, putting the square in front of American audiences a decade before the hippies came. The movies never really left. Marrakech and the desert country beyond the mountains became a base for productions from the golden age of epics onward, and the studios at Ouarzazate would eventually stand in for ancient Egypt, Rome, and half the fictional kingdoms on television. But the person who may have done the most for the city's future was neither a rock star nor a director. He was a painter's ghost. In the 1920s and 30s, a French artist named Jacques Majorelle had built himself a garden in the new town, a small paradise of cactus, palms, and bamboo arranged around a studio painted in a blue so intense that it carries his name to this day, Majorelle Blue. After his death, the garden decayed, and by the late 1970s, it was threatened with demolition for a hotel project. Saint Laurent and Berger bought it and restored it. When Saint Laurent died in 2008, his ashes were scattered there, and in 2017, a museum bearing his name opened beside the garden. Today, the garden draws enormous crowds, and the blue of a once-forgotten painter has become one of the images the whole world now files under Marrakech. While the visitors multiplied, something more important was happening in the heart of the Medina, and it centres on the square we have returned to throughout this story. By the late 20th century, Gemma Elfner was under quiet threat, not from an enemy, but from convenience. There was traffic. There were proposals over the years to develop the space, to pave it, to tidy the great chaotic square into something more manageable. And the halka performers themselves, the storytellers whose circles were the square's ancient soul, were aging. While their audiences drifted toward television, the counterattack came from an unexpected direction. A celebrated Spanish writer named Juan Goytisolo had settled in Marrakech, living near the square, and he became convinced that what happened in Gemma Elfner every evening was not local colour. It was a treasure of human civilization, a living library where literature was still performed the way it had been before print. In the 1990s, he and a circle of allies campaigned to protect it, and their campaign reached UNESCO at exactly the moment that organization was rethinking what heritage meant. Buildings and monuments had long been protected, but what about the things that are not objects? songs, crafts, rituals, spoken stories. In 2001, UNESCO issued its first proclamation of masterpieces of the oral and intangible heritage of humanity, a new effort to protect living culture. The cultural space of Gemma el Fna was among the first group of traditions and spaces recognized worldwide, and UNESCO's own materials credit the Marrakech campaign as one of the direct inspirations for the whole idea. Sit with that for a moment. The square where storytellers had passed tales hand to hand for centuries helped teach the modern world that a story can be a monument. Money was arriving too, and it changed the Medina from the inside, beginning in the 1990s and accelerating fast after 2000. Foreigners, at first mostly French, discovered that the old courtyard houses of the Medina, the riads, could be bought and restored. What followed was a wholesale revival of traditional crafts: plasterwork, cedar carving, zeli tilework. As hundreds of crumbling houses became guest houses and homes, the results were genuinely double-edged, and both edges are true. The restoration saved buildings and skills that were dying, and put money in the hands of thousands of artisans. It also drove prices beyond the reach of many Medina families, and turned parts of the old city into a place that serves visitors more than residents. Residents and researchers have documented both effects, and an honest telling holds them together. The wider world kept choosing Marrakech for its gatherings. In April of 1994, diplomats from more than 100 countries met in the city to sign the agreement creating the World Trade Organization, and that founding document is formally called the Marrakech Agreement. The city of the caravans, the old counting house of the Sahara, lent its name to the constitution of modern global trade. History does have a sense of humor. In 2016, the city hosted the United Nations Climate Conference, known as COP22, and its film festival, founded in 2001, grew into one of the most prominent on the continent. And in these same years, a very old promise from the beginning of this film was finally kept. In 2011, a new Moroccan constitution recognized Tamazight, the Amazigh language, as an official language of the state, alongside Arabic. Think back to Chapter 1, to the people who were here before the city, whose own name is often popularly rendered as the Free People, the languages of that world, spoken on this land long before Marrakech existed, and pushed to the margins through every empire this story has told, were now written into the nation's founding law. Walk through Marrakech today and look at the lettering on the government buildings. Beside the Arabic and the French you will see a third script, angular and old-looking, called Tifinagh. The empires of this story came and went in Arabic, Spanish, Portuguese, and French. The first language of the land was still there when the waiting ended. There was darkness in these decades too, and we will not hide it. In April of 2011, a bomb tore through the Argana Cafe on Gemma el Fna itself, killing 17 people, most of them foreign visitors. It was the worst attack in Morocco in years, and it struck the exact place this story has treated as the city's heart. The square answered the way it always has. It reopened. The crowds came back, and the storytellers' circles formed again on the same stones. Because a place that has survived 900 years does not know how to do anything else. By the 2010s, Marrakech had become one of the most visited cities on the African continent, with millions of arrivals a year and direct flights from across Europe, and a tourism economy that fed a huge share of the city. The transformation from the hungry decades of independence was astonishing, and it rested, if you stand back, on the same ancient foundations, the walls, the tower, the gardens, the square, everything the city had been too poor, or too wise, to throw away. And then, on a September night in 2023, at 11 minutes past 11, the ground beneath the house plain began to move, and 900 years of stubbornness were tested in less than a minute. Chapter 12. When the Atlas moved. At 11 minutes past 11 on the night of September 8th, 2023, the people of Marrakech were doing the things a city does on a warm Friday night. The square was full, the cafes were full, and then the ground made a sound. Survivors interviewed afterward kept reaching for the same descriptions. A roar that came from below rather than from any direction, walls that moved like fabric, a shaking that lasted well under a minute and seemed, to the people inside it, to have no end at all. The earthquake measured 6.8 in magnitude according to the United States Geological Survey, and its epicenter was not in the city. It was in the High Atlas, in Al-Haouz Province, in the mountain country south of Marrakech. Hear that name, Al-Haouz, the plain and the mountains that gave this city its water, its founders, and its name were now the source of the deadliest earthquake in Morocco since the Agadir disaster of 1960. By the official counts reported that autumn, nearly 3,000 people were killed, and thousands more were injured. Honesty about that number requires geography. The overwhelming share of the dead were not in Marrakech. They were in the mountain villages of the Atlas, the old Masmuda country of our earliest chapters, where houses built of earth and stone collapsed onto sleeping families, and where rescuers needed days simply to reach some valleys because the roads were buried. The world's cameras pointed at Marrakech because the world knows Marrakech. The deepest grief was in the mountains above it, and any telling of this story owes those villages that acknowledgement. Up in those mountains stood a building this story has visited before. The mosque at Tinmel, the 12th century sanctuary of the Almoravids, the cradle of the movement that built the Couture, was largely brought down by the shaking. Its arches collapsed into rubble. Reports since describe restoration work underway. But the ruin of Tinmel is also a warning against easy lessons. Some historic structures in the region came through remarkably well, and others, Tinmel among them, were devastated, and some newer buildings failed while others stood. Engineers quoted in the aftermath were careful to say that age alone determined nothing. Design, materials, upkeep, the ground underneath, and the distance from the epicenter all mattered. The earthquake did not reward the old for being old. It found the weaknesses wherever they were. In the city itself, Marrakech shook hard. In the Medina, houses cracked and some collapsed, and there were deaths inside the old walls. The minaret of the Karbouch Mosque, on the edge of Jamar el-Fna itself, came down onto the square where the storytellers gather. Parts of the red walls, the rammed earth ramparts of 1126, cracked and shed sections of their facing, cracked, shed sections, and stood. The circuit of the walls held. The Couture was inspected in the days after the quake and reported essentially sound. More than 8 centuries after it was finished, the ground of the Haouz plain, packed into walls by Almoravid labourers, had passed one more test, this time not of armies but of the earth itself. What happened next deserves recording plainly, without turning grief into a slogan. In the first days, Moroccans lined up in large numbers to give blood, and aid convoys ran south from every major city. The government announced a multi-year reconstruction program for the mountain zone. measured in billions of dollars, and reporting in the time since describes rebuilding that is real, and also, as rebuilding always is, slower and harder than the promises, with families in some villages still in temporary shelter long afterward. Both of those things are true, and both belong in the record. The city's own recovery moved faster than almost anyone expected in the shaken days of that September. There were forecasts then that tourism, which feeds a huge share of Marrakech, would collapse for years. It did not. Visitors kept coming, partly because the damage in the areas most travellers see was limited, and partly because the city asked them, plainly, to come. Within weeks, Marrakech went ahead with the annual meetings of the International Monetary Fund and the World Bank, a decision debated at the time and defended by Moroccan officials as a way of saying the city was still standing. And in the year that followed, 2024, Morocco reported record visitor numbers nationally, with Marrakech as the leading gateway. That figure is one you should confirm against the latest official tally before citing it, because tourism statistics are revised as new data arrives. The calendar ahead explains the rest. Under plans announced as of the middle of 2026, Morocco is set to co-host the 2030 World Cup together with Spain and Portugal, in a tournament whose centenary arrangements also involve opening matches in South America, and Marrakech is among the Moroccan host cities named so far, though specific venues and match schedules can still change before the event. Hold that map in your mind for a second all the same. Morocco, Spain, Portugal, the lands of the Almoravids and the Almohads, of Sagrajas and Seville and the Giralda, brought under one banner again, 9 centuries after Yusuf ibn Tashfin crossed the strait, this time for a game. History does not repeat, but it rhymes. There is one more thread to pull before we close, and it is the oldest thread we have: water. The years around the earthquake were also years of severe drought across Morocco, among the worst in decades by official accounts, with reservoirs falling to a fraction of capacity and restrictions reaching into daily life. The ancien Ketara channels, the underground miracle of Chapter 4, have mostly fallen dry or out of use across the plain, as modern wells and pumps lowered the water table beneath them. The city answers now with modern tools: dams and pipelines and drip irrigation, and desalination projects on the national scale, and with an argument, live in Morocco today, about how a land of gardens and golf courses lives on a drying plain. 9 centuries ago, the founders of Marrakech looked at dry ground and answered it with patience and engineering. Their descendants are being asked the same question, with higher stakes and less time. The argument with the desert, the one we began this film inside, has never actually ended. So here is the city in 2026, walls cracked and standing, mountains grieving and rebuilding, the square full again by nightfall, the water uncertain, nearly 1,000 years old, and still, somehow, arguing with the sand. It is time to go back to the square one last time and ask what all of it means. Chapter 13. What the Red City Knows. Come back to Jemar el Fnar at sunset, where we began. The light is doing the thing it does only here, turning the walls from red to rose to ember as the sun drops toward the Atlas. The snow on the peaks catches the last of it. The food stalls are firing, and the smoke rises through strings of lights. Somewhere to your left, a drum starts, and in a circle of listeners near the center of the square, a storyteller lifts his hand, and strangers lean in. You know things now that the crowd around you may not. So look again. With the eyes this journey has given you, look down first, through the stones, toward the dark where the water ran. The Kettera channels are mostly silent now, but they are still there. Miles of them, hand-dug, threading the plain like buried roots, cleared and guarded for centuries by families whose names are lost. They are the answer to the first question this film asked. The city was built on ground that seemed to promise nothing, and it exists because people refused to accept what the ground appeared to say. That refusal is the oldest thing in Marrakech, older than the walls, and the plain is demanding it again right now. As the rains thin, the first Marrakechis answered impossible ground with a tunnel and a slope. Their descendants have to answer it again, and the whole of this history is one long argument that they will. Now, look at the walls, the ember-coloured miles of them, raised in 1126 out of the plain itself. Everything this story has thrown at the city is written there. They broke the first Almohad assault. They watched the empire leave for Fez and stood through 2 centuries of being forgotten. They held the Sardian gold, the French avenues, the crowds of the independent spring. In 2023, the earth itself took hold of them, and they cracked and shed their skin in places and stood. Endurance is not the absence of damage. It is what you do with the damage. And now look around you, at the square, because the square is the deepest answer of all. Empires are loud, and empires end. Think of the cycle Ibn Khaldun described at the very start of this film. Hard men from the margins conquering the soft, rich centre, then softening, then falling to the next hard men. We watched it turn, over and over. The desert Almoravids who founded this city, then softened, and fell to the mountain Almohads, who crowned it, then softened, and fell in their turn. The Sardians who gilded it, the French who mapped it, all of them are gone, and the last time the cycle turned, in our own century, it did not bring a conqueror at all. It brought a constitution that finally wrote the oldest language of this land back into the life of the nation. The wheel that Ibn Khaldun watched grind cities to dust turned, at the end, toward memory instead, because what survived all those empires is not a palace. It is this, an open space where a human being stands up in front of strangers and says, in effect, listen, and the strangers stop and listen. That has been happening on this ground, evening after evening, through every chapter we have told, and it helped teach the modern world, through UNESCO, that heritage can be a living act, and not only a building. The storyteller's circle outlived the caliphs. If you want to know what a civilization actually runs on, there is your evidence. Not gold. Attention. The gold roads moved on centuries ago, and the city learned to trade in the one thing that never loses its value, which is wonder. The city at the edge of the Sahara refused to stay at the edge. That was our promise at the start, and you have seen it kept. A camp of veiled riders on rejected ground became the seat of an empire that spanned 2 continents, gave its name, in distant languages, to an entire nation, and raised a tower whose family stands today in Rabat, in Seville, and, at several removes, in skylines across the ocean. It survived its own irrelevance twice, for centuries at a time, and each time the world found it again, the world was really finding the same thing, a place that decided 9.5 centuries ago that where you are is not what you are. The storyteller in the circle is finishing now. If you could hear him across the noise, across the language, you would know the shape of what he is doing, because you have just spent this whole film inside it. A voice, a crowd, and 1,000 years passed hand to hand, the way the water passed underground, invisible and essential, from the mountains to the gardens. The snow is fading on the atlas, the lamps are lit, the circle is still open, and there is room in it for you.